Okay, welcome to the next lecture. This is on ancient beer. You probably might not have thought beer as being the first alcoholic beverage associated with civilization, but it is. And I'd like to start with a hymn that comes from the Sumerian culture, and I want you to pay attention to the descriptions within the hymn that really look like a beer-making process. And we'll talk about various elements within the poem itself. But let's start just with reading it. So this is a hymn to Ninkasi, an excerpt from that. Born of the flowing water, tenderly cared for by the Ninhursag, Ninkasi, having founded your town by the sacred lake, she finished its great walls for you. Your father is Enki, Lord Didymud. Your mother is Ninti, the queen of the sacred lake. Mixing in a pit the bapir with sweet aromatics, Ninkasi, you are the one who handles the dough, and with a big shovel. Ninkasi, you are the one who bakes the bapir in the big oven, puts in order the piles of hulled grains. Ninkasi, you are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. The noble dogs keep away even the potentates. Ninkasi, you are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. The waves rise, the waves fall. Ninkasi, you are the one who spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats. Coolness overcomes. You are the one who holds with both hands the sweet wort, brewing it with honey and wine. Ninkasi, the filtering vat, which makes a pleasant sound, you place appropriately on top of a large collector vat. Ninkasi, you are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is like the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. Now let's look very briefly at just a couple of elements in this poem. The onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates, those are, of course, the two rivers that are that surround Mesopotamia, in which is today mostly Iraq. So Tigris and Euphrates implies that there's a lot of beer, right? And indeed there was. But the other things that interest me here are the bapir, what that actually is. It seems to be a starter that's baked in the oven, kind of like a bread that's got yeast in it, that will kickstart the whole fermentation process. And then there are a couple of words in here that I assume are just the translation that include the malt in a jar. We'll talk about what that malt is, the cooked mash, various words here that are used that are obviously refer to modern brewing techniques. The wort also, we'll discuss what that is. What is also interesting is the fact that there seems to be honey and wine in this also, maybe to start the fermentation process. The filtering I'm not sure about, because we'll see that the Sumerians didn't systematically filter their beer. But before we go into some of the details about Sumerian culture and what's going on in this poem, let's go back to the wider story and think about last time we were talking about hallucinogenic plants in prehistoric culture and the use of things like henbane and other herbs that are used to cause other states of mind. They quite often go into beer also. And archaeological evidence, which is what we're going to turn to now, along with the historical evidence, shows that the earliest beers were brewed with herbs that do a couple of things. They flavor the beer. They also serve as preservatives, right? They make it a little bitter, and that prevents bacteria from growing. And they serve a function that's not unlike what hops do today, right? Hops flavor and also act as a preservative. And they're strange. You might not know this. Hops are a cousin of marijuana. They don't have any psychotropic values, but they certainly do change the beverage and make it last longer. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the hymn to Ninkasi actually includes the term sweet herbs, right? The poem itself dates to the 19th century BC. It's about 2,000 years BC. And notice also that it mentions this honey and wine. That sounds sort of revolting to us, I know, but that seems to be fairly typical and may have been necessary to induce this fermentation. So what does the archaeological evidence tell us? Well, ancient beer residues were left in clay jars that date from about 700 BC. It's much younger than that, of course. These come from central Turkey, and they've been analyzed by this guy named Patrick McGovern. He's kind of the preeminent archaeologist of ancient beer and alcohol in general at the University of Pennsylvania. And he did a dig at this site, which is called Midas's tomb. Midas, you probably remember, Midas's touch, everything he touched turned to gold. Well, that was a real king in a place near Turkey called Gordion. And what he uncovered is that the residues on these pot shards and bits of pot, of course the pots themselves never disappear. Once you throw a piece of broken pottery into the ground, it's there forever. But these contained a couple of indicators of what was in the jar. Not the actual contents, but chemicals left over. The first is tartaric acid. That's a byproduct of wine manufacture. It's actually cream of tartar. If you can buy it, they use it to whip egg whites and things. There was also beeswax, which came from honey, and apparently that lasts in a jar forever. It never disintegrates. And then lastly, calcium oxalate, which is called beer stone, which is a kind of, it's a signature for barley. And I'll talk in a minute why barley is so important specifically. So you may have actually tasted a vague simulacrum of this beer. It's been brewed, called the Midas Touch, brewed by a company called Dogfish Head Brewery in Rehoboth, Delaware. I'm not sure how close they actually got. Certainly they're using modern brewing techniques, but they also add saffron, which I'm not sure what that would do to the whole thing in the end. And I find it strange that this beer, I once did a beer tasting for a reunion weekend, and we tasted some really exceptionally great beers, and a big group of about 40, 50 people, this is the one they like the most. I'm not sure why, but I guess it's sweet and it sort of goes down easily, but how close it is to the original, I'm not really sure. But in any case, this I'm bringing up this beer from Midas because it seems to match all the characteristics that we're talking about in Sumerian beer. So let's look at that. There's beer that's of course much older than 700 BC, and beer made from barley dates to about 3,400 BC. That's found in the Zagros Mountains of Iran, a place called Godi Tepe. And in fact, it's almost the same place that the earliest wine comes from. That's Haji Firuz, dating to 5,400 BC. Neither of these are actually the oldest alcohol on Earth. That actually dates to 7,000 BC, and that comes from China. We're talking about, of course, rice wine there in the Yellow River Valley. But just notice that all of these are places where civilization begins. And I think the argument I'm going to try and make through this lecture is that civilization and alcohol are very, very closely related. They grow together. So these are the kind of oldest direct evidence, but really only because they're found in bits of pottery. And pottery itself, of course, is very closely related to civilization. But I think there are definitely older alcoholic beverages, probably fermented fruit juices, because those ferment on their own. There's not much you have to do. And those were probably kept in skins or wooden vessels, like a hollowed out log or something. And of course, those have disintegrated. So we don't really have old evidence that goes back to the earliest civilization, 10,000 BC, and probably even before then, people were consuming some form of alcohol. I'll come back to these other forms of drink, but I want to start with beer because it's the most important beverage for the earliest civilization on Earth. And that is Sumer. We're talking about the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, between those two rivers. And actually, I should mention, you can actually make beer out of anything. It's, millet makes a decent beer, wheat makes beer, but there's reason barley is preferred. There's a couple of reasons. One is because once barley is sprouted, you just sort of wet it, and then a little sprout starts to come out of it. The grain actually releases enzymes that will start to convert the starch into sugar. And that's, the sugars are, of course, what feeds the growing plant and allows it to form roots and leaves and everything. But the point is that you need sugar in order to make alcohol, right? So turning a starch into a sugar is a very crucial part of this whole step. And only once you have sugar are those attacked by yeast and turned into the alcohol. Now, the question is, we don't really know how anyone would have figured this out. May have been an accident. You imagine someone storing grain and then it accidentally getting wet, and then it sprouts spontaneously, and then, they said, oh, what do we do? Let's dry this again. Well, what they've got there is basically malt, okay? So when this is done intentionally, you basically just soak the grain itself, let it sprout. It takes just a couple of days, and then dry it quickly, which you do over a low fire. So it'll toast, it'll give, of course, give color to the beer. And what you're doing is stopping it at the point where all of the sugar that would have gone into growing the plant is actually still in the grain. And what you have there is something called malt. Okay, this is some technical terms I'd like you to know. Now, the interesting thing about malt is that you can store it, which means you can make beer year-round. It's very different than wine in that respect, because wine, of course, you can only make one time a year when the harvest comes in, and you've got to make it all. It's a big production if you need a lot of wine for the year. Beer is something that you can actually store the malt and then make beer every week, however long you want. Now, how it's done is you take this malt, you grind it up coarsely, and then you put it into heated water between 145 and 155 degrees Fahrenheit. And this activates those enzymes. This is cytase and diastase, which releases the sugar. And this process, another term I'd like you to know, is saccharification. Okay, that just means to become sugar. Okay? This then is strained, and you have this thick kind of syrupy stuff that's sweet called wort. Okay, W-O-R-T. You can then actually pour hot water on the grains again, and that's called sparging. That will get out every last little drop of the sugar that will become alcohol. You then leave this wort to cool, and then the yeast either falls into the vat, or you introduce it from a previous batch, or you add some other starter, like maybe this Bapir, this kind of, or with fermenting honey, something that already has the yeast in it. And then it begins to bubble, okay? And essentially what's happening is those sugars are being eaten up by the yeast. They're farting in the form of carbon dioxide, which makes the bubbles, and then the sugar is turned into alcohol. And from something like this, you can get 3 to 5% alcohol level. It doesn't last very long, but it can be made any time of year. And the point is, you store the malt. You're not storing the beer. There's nothing really to keep the beer fresh in the beer itself, right? Not yet. So food historians, they usually point to wheat and bread as the crucial catalyst in the agricultural revolution. This is something that happened about 10,000 years ago, when people went from being hunters and gatherers to being sedentary farmers and pastoralists. And they usually say, well, wheat is the thing that made it possible, that they could grow so much wheat that they could live on it and have it be the staple of their diet rather than gathering and hunting, obviously. But the point that I want to make is that beer is not just something to make you happy or to use in celebrations or whatever. It's actually a staple in the diet. It's very nutritious, okay? Unlike many other, obviously drugs, this is one that it really is a nourishment for them. They really depend on it as much as they do beer. And beer was brewed on a vast scale in the city of Uruk. Okay, this is the place we'll be talking about in Sumer. Vessels that could produce 300 gallons a day survive in the remnants of an ancient brewery. There's also evidence on cuneiform tablets, and I should mention what cuneiform is, the writing system that the Sumerians developed. This is a little cuneiform tablet I made, but it's got these cuneus means a wedge, and so you press these little wedges into the clay, and you get this writing. It's the oldest form of writing, in fact. And in the cuneiform tablets, it says there's evidence that the Sumerians regulated beer drinking. They regulated the establishments where it could be served, and they also used it ceremonially, I should say. Figures on seals, and the Egyptians had these little round cylinder seals that would basically serve as a signature. You'd roll it into wet clay, and then your name would be on it. But they have pictures of people sucking beer through long straws. So it seems like the Sumerians didn't actually strain their beer, or at least not most of it. And the point of this is you still have grain in the jar when you're drinking it out of there, and you push the straw down through the surface of these grains, and you get the liquid only. So it acts as a kind of strainer. Now, people have suggested that the floating matter on the top might actually prevent the spoilage and insects from getting in and things like that. So and you also, of course, see Sumerians drinking out of cups with these long straws. It seems to be a communal thing, kind of like sitting around a hookah, and everyone takes a straw and drinks. There are also depictions of people drinking out of cups without these, and the guess is at least that this is wine. It's more expensive. They had to get it from the mountains and ship it down, so it's a luxury item really. It's too hot to grow in the plains in the Euphrates, in Mesopotamia. I mean. The Sumerians also give us the oldest drinking story as well. Really a fascinating thing. It's in a book called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's mentioned actually in Churzin in the reading, in which the king of Uruk, this is the place we're talking about, decides that he needs a sidekick to accompany him on his adventures. And he wants someone who's big and strong and, so he decides to go out and search for someone, and he finds this guy who fits the bill, named Enkidu, but Enkidu, unfortunately, is a wild man. Okay, he's not been civilized. He's a hunter and gatherer, basically. Okay, so he's not one of the Sumerians. And so before he can join Gilgamesh, Enkidu's got to be tamed, and the way to do that is with the products of civilization. First and foremost, this means eating bread and drinking beer. Let me quote you a little piece here. It says, of drinking beer he had not been taught, but then Enkidu ate the food until he was sated, and he drank the beer, 7 jugs, and he became expansive and sang with joy. Now, you'd think this would be enough to do it, to make him, follow Gilgamesh and become civilized. It doesn't actually. So Gilgamesh tries another thing, and he gets him a prostitute. And the prostitute lifts her skirt up, and then then he's hooked, okay? And then he becomes fully human, and I'll read it to you. His soul became free and cheerful. His heart rejoiced, his face glowed, he rubbed his hairy body, he anointed himself with oil, and he became fully human. And the point of this is that, civilized people clean themselves, actually. Actually, that's what they did. They used to put oil on themselves and scrape it off, and then all the dirt would come off. And so it's drinking beer, naked women, and then cleaning yourself. And Freud actually said that soap is the yardstick of civilization. Cleaning yourself. So that's what he needs to become fully human. But so the lesson here, though, is that drinking is a fundamental and necessary part of becoming fully human, of becoming a civilized human. And again, this argument I'm going to make is that civilization and alcohol are very, very closely entwined for a lot of reasons. As Sumerians, as I said, they also had wine, but that seems to have been reserved for elite people. Ordinary people drank beer, and in vast quantities. Sumerian kings actually did drink it also. And the public rituals in Sumerian culture involved drinking large quantities, and in fact the most important ritual in their culture was the symbolic and I should say literal union of the king of Uruk with the high priestess of the temple of Ishtar. And Ishtar maybe sounds a little familiar to you. Ishtar is the same word as Easter. She's the goddess of procreation that gets so subsumed into Christian culture. But apparently these two people would copulate, and their progeny was the incarnation of the beer goddess Ninkasi, mentioned in the poem to start. And, you might know there's also a brewing company called Ninkasi Brewing. It's pretty good. So let me mention that this civilization, the Sumerians, didn't actually last very long. They were invaded by other cultures who came in, adopted their beer and the trappings of civilization, the farming and pastoralism. And that keeps happening over and over again. So the Sumerians, then the Akkadians, then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians, then the Persians. So there's a lot of different empires run through this place. But let's focus on one. These are the Babylonians. And they wrote a law code called the Code of Hammurabi. It's actually the oldest law code on earth, which, not surprisingly, mentions beer. It mentions the price of beer, the strength of it. The date is 1772 BC, so it's about 300, 400 years after. And the laws give us an indication that there are public places where people can buy beer, taverns, if you will. And most interestingly, that they were run by women. And that's something very common in many civilizations, up through modern times, actually. Women are often the brewers, and it's only when you get to a really enormous scale of brewing that takes a lot of physical strength, and on an industrial scale, of course, in the modern era, that men become the brewers. But to start with, it's usually women. But let me read you a couple of these laws, and we'll discuss them in class. Number 108 as if a tavern keeper, and the word is feminine here, does not accept corn. And I should mention the word corn here just means grain. That's a Britishism. They don't mean maize. They mean barley. If the tavern keeper does not accept corn according to the gross weight in payment of drink, but takes money, and the price of the drink is less than that of the corn, she shall be convicted and thrown in the water. In other words, she can't cheat her customers, basically. Number 109, if conspirators meet in the house of a tavern keeper, and these conspirators are not captured and delivered to court, the tavern keeper shall be put to death. Now, this is sort of weird, but, you imagine, if we're going to read through the lines of this thing, that taverns are a place where subversive talk goes on, and where people can gather together and express their dissatisfaction with the state. So if you run a tavern, they want you to turn anyone in if they are speaking suspiciously. I find that really, really interesting. Number 110, if a sister of a god, this is a consecrated holy woman, open a tavern or even enter a tavern to drink, this woman shall be burned to death. Okay, they really don't want their holy women drinking, for whatever reason. Number 111, if an innkeeper furnish 60 ka of usakani drink to someone, she shall receive 50 ka of corn at the harvest. And so this, it actually also looks after the tavern keepers to make sure that they're paid respectably. Remember, they don't have money in this civilization. They're paid in kind, in grain, and then they turn that back into drink, I guess, and make a profit. So the reputation of Mesopotamian peoples as beer drinkers actually lasts for centuries. Let's sort of give you some insight from later historians, who are mostly Greeks, who are talking about the Mesopotamian habits. The historian Xenophon says that there are soldiers who were retreating from Persia, had to drink strong barley wine. They drank it through straws. He just describes that too. And he says that the poor people in this region, how did this happen to them? How come they have to drink beer and not wine? And the tale goes that Dionysus got so angry at the Babylonians for slighting him that he kept grape wine from them and made them live on beer as a punishment. And we'll see throughout that the Greeks and Romans really looked at beer drinking as barbaric. It's something they didn't do it, or they not very often. So let's turn to the Egyptians, because they're actually a very similar story. The Egyptians did also have beer and wine. Beer was the universal drink. Everyone drank beer. If you were wealthy, you drank wine. It was much more expensive for elites. It grows in the delta. There are places you can grow wine, but most of Egypt is much too hot for that. But in any case, the ancient Egyptian city of Nekhen, which is the Greeks called Hierakonpolis, there are remains of a pretty intact brewery, dating to about 3,400 BC, that's pre-dynastic. That's before they even have pharaohs and start counting the kings. And it seems to have been a major center for pottery, because there are shards of pots and cups and things that are broken all over the city. And when something breaks, they just threw it in the trash heap and then built on top of it, right? So when you dig it up, you find all these shards. But the ubiquity of these broken shards implies that everyone drank it. Beer is really nourishing, right? And I should mention also, the very important point I'll make throughout the course, is that not only is beer really nourishing for calories, it's a safe form of hydration, right? Because remember, you're boiling the beer, you're killing all the bad bacteria, and once the good bacteria invade it, the yeast and probably lactobacilli also, that makes it a little sour, other bacteria are not going to grow in it. So it's a much safer beverage than water, where you may get, cholera or dysentery or something, and that's the price that people pay for civilization. You live near the place where your garbage and feces go, it can contaminate the water source. So beer is a much, much safer drink, and it will hydrate you, right? So in any case, this the Egyptians called beer hekt, HQT, and it formed a part of the payment for builders of the pyramids. They got about 1 1/3 gallons a day. That's 4 to 5 liters. That's 2 very big Egyptian bottles of beer. It sounds like a lot to us, doesn't it? But again, think this is the way they got hydrated. And we tend to think, oh, how could someone possibly work if they're drunk all day? Well, think, again, that this is not really high alcohol beer. Probably not more than 5%. But again, that's, a socially constructed concept of being drunk. They don't have that. And you can work on a few beers, but I don't know how you do it on a lot, but still, just keep that in mind, because the idea is that, they definitely drank a lot. How is a question it's hard for us to answer. And again, we don't really know if the water was terribly dangerous, but alcohol is definitely safe. So there is a festival called Tekhi, in which it is expected that people not only drink beer, but get completely drunk. Okay, let me describe this, because it might seem even stranger to you that they want people to get sauced. It's a celebration of an event that celebrates the drunkenness of Hathor. Okay, Hathor is the goddess of moisture. I know, that's not water, just moist things. She takes the form of a cow. She has this dish on her head with her two horns. She's beautiful and lovely. And it takes place during the annual flooding of the Nile. And you might know the Nile, floods every year. That's a good thing, because it brings fertile soil down and silt, and that's why the whole Nile Valley is very, very fertile. And it happens in the first month of the year. And the myth that informs this festival, in this, Hathor finds out that there is a plot to kill her husband, Ra, R-E. He's the head sun god, right? And she suddenly gets so angry when she hears about this plot that she transforms into the war goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet has a feline head, and she's not someone you trifle with. And she decides